I think we can start the session. So my name is Ville. I'm from POM, and welcome to the second edition of Postnormal Talks. Postnormal Talks is basically our response to the changed narrative of the reality. And we started a couple of months ago to do research together with our colleagues to understand the kind of changed situations and the opportunities for organizations to actually adapt and react and respond. And what we did, we kind of looked the world from two different angles. On the other hand, from the point of view of people, to really understand the everyday implications, how life was changing. And the second point of view was, of course, from organizations. What are the opportunities to do something that really, truly matters? So, as we already know, kind of life changed quite dramatically. There are a few domains of business as well as everyday life that also quite dramatic, deep shifts on the levels of values, behaviors, everyday practices, as well as services used in order to facilitate more fluid, meaningful interactions and behaviors in everyday lives. So that is stuff that we covered in the first Postnormal Talks, as well as we went through what we did. Just there are a few more people coming in. Sorry. No, I lost my cursor. Just a sec. When I have presentation mode on, apparently I can't let people in. Okay. Here again. Yeah, so what we did, we looked how companies can actually respond to the situation on three different kind of strategic horizons. Something that can be right now, something that probably should be done next, and something that is relevant always. Kind of that inquiry led us to 15 different strategic plays, which are still available. You can read them if you're interested in. It's on our site under views, called the Postnormal Playbook, where we look the ways how you can actually respond. Chances someone else coming in. Okay, no. But the question for today is that as we are now moving, at least in quite a few European countries to begin with, from taming the contagion to this moment that we start to learn how to live our lives in new ways. Of course, in different countries, the story is totally different. In Finland, we've been in fortunate position that for the past 4 weeks already, I think everything has fallen in place in a way that it feels that in most situations, you don't even notice the difference anymore, what used to be and what is now. So it was an interesting ride, but kind of we're now again here living our lives, enjoying the summer. But the important question still is that how could we now kind of continue and move forward from here? One more person coming in. There we go. And as we learned collectively to take really radical measures as a society to flatten the COVID-19 curve. So the question that came kind of quite concrete to us as we started to debate with Tom and James, like how should we frame this session and discussion, is that how could those same ideas, the same logic be applied to collective and healing, collective care that is urgently now needed in order to move forward. And the second question probably that needs to be debated is that what is the care that we actually need? Because care is not only health care, as we know, but it's care for people, it's care for distress, care for human flourishing. It's care on a more broader level, care for all citizens and all different communities, care for human rights, care for equality, and at the same time care for biosphere and its population. So care as a concept is something that we wanted to play with and introduce the idea that it has to start from caring about mental stress, caring about us after the dramatic experiences. And moving forward, we need to understand how could then companies now realign themselves with care. Where are the areas of life where people would most welcome care from organizations and companies? What kind of opportunities there are actually emerging? And most importantly, what's the difference between kind of immediate care as well as care on the long term and on those many different avenues of care? But this is the framing for today's discussion. And we have today here with me Tom Savigar, who's now the founder of Avansere, very inspiring and interesting agency focusing on tackling the biggest issues from the climate perspective that we have. James Endersby, the CEO of Opinium, a London and New York-based agency, and me. Tom and James, would you like to introduce yourself briefly, and then Tom has promised to share briefly the latest results from a very interesting survey made just last week dealing with mental stress.
Thank you, Ville. And don't underestimate yourself.
Yeah.
Ville, I've known Ville for a long time, and as one of the world's leaders in terms of insight and what that means to strategy and brand. So it's nice to be here with you, Ville, again. So no, it's a big question. I think this is those of you who know me, and most of you I think do on who have joined. I think I like to start the day with lots of questions, and that we don't have any answers yet. So I think the point being, this is a very big question of how traumatic has it been, and how traumatic will it be? What I'd specialize in is making sure that if there is an organization that wants to move forward and succeed, that it does that at no expense to human needs within planetary boundaries, which is not an easy equation. So I think as we go through this, James, Ville, and I will all jump in and we'll talk through the slides. But it is very much about trying to answer some of these big questions. James, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks, Tom. And I think we've worked together for 10 years, so that's about a collective 20 between the three of us of good solid work, understanding and exploring big issues. Delighted to join this conversation. We've been doing such a huge amount of work around the world trying to understand how populations are responding to the big issues of the day, of course, as always, and no bigger than this. Delighted to share this research. I've got a few other bits and pieces from the well-being work we do. Let's get stuck in. All right, over to you, Tom.
Okay, so the plan is for everyone, we're going to show all the slides. We're going to record this, which is, I think, webinar etiquette now. So you'll have a full recording plus the slides as well. We've obviously been seeding it on LinkedIn and personal emails for a couple of weeks now. We have about 20 slides or so, which by my experience usually takes about half an hour to present. We don't want this to be a one-way conversation, but we want to get through some interesting and I think quite surprising content. And then hopefully you have lots of questions. If you have questions as we're going through, obviously put them in the chat. And then Ville, while presenting, while letting people in, will also read the questions, and we'll go from there. But so we'll hopefully have about 25 minutes to do questions as well. Okay, so Ville, you're my clicker, aren't you? So
yeah, I am.
If we go to the next slide, I think there was an assumption. You got that? Okay, yeah. On the next slide. So there was an assumption that it's been all bad, shock, fear, isolation, regret or aggression, grief, a lot of grieving. But I think laced within that has certainly been in a lot of corporate commentary, the importance of resilience and regeneration and reform, and that word resetting. And I think that aspirational hope, or that feeling of there could be silver linings in all of this, has I think made its way through to a lot of big mainstream newspapers and the likes of The Economist. So we wanted to just understand, like all these things, the human in the mix, and how severe has this been mentally? Has it been distressful? Has it been something that is impeding people's lives from a mental to physical perspective? So we wanted to test that. So we asked the UK public, 2,000 British adults, representative of the population, 9 questions. Those of you interested, I think we could obviously repeat this in other countries. That would be very important to do as well. So this is just a British perspective. But Ville, you were saying when the results came through that I think a lot of European cities have nodded in a similar way, saying actually there's probably some similarities across European capitals. So if we go to the next slide, the first sort of thing we wanted to look at was there was evidence, especially in the UK, but also in America, of this rising sort of mental health curve problem, that there seemed to be a tsunami of complaints and discussions around, in the US, for example, a 70% increase in adults experiencing mental health issues in the last year alone because of COVID-19. And then in the UK, according to Reba here and Unwind, a conversation around when it comes to workplace specifically, which I know, James, you'll pick up on a lot based on the work you're doing, that managers and the HR teams are starting to have this influx of people saying, I'm actually very stressed out about what's going on. I really hope that you're going to do something about this if I do come back, or if I have to stay away from the office, please service me digitally. Preparing for this, I guess, this care moment, as you're saying, Ville, and 85% believing that the virus has or will negatively impact on employees' mental health, which has a huge impact on remuneration conversations, work-life balance, and working from anywhere. I don't know about you, but I have 3 children, and my prime hour has now become 6 o'clock, where I start to actually do some work. So, which isn't good for anyone's mental health. So it's there's a lot of unnormality around what is normal work. But this isn't a presentation about work only. If we go to the next slide. So the first thing is, how have people felt over the last 3 months? And if you just keep going, Ville, it's been quite I don't know if this is a surprise, but I thought this was indicative of, I think, a sense of almost implicit resilience, especially within Britain. I'm sure this isn't the same in other countries, but the majority of people have felt that they've dealt with the situation. But at the same time, a very similar amount of people have said they've been very fearful. But then some have said they felt very comfortable, and others have felt very unconfident. So there's this interesting sort of polarity here around, well, there are some who have felt that they've dealt with it and they felt almost in control, and some who have felt like they're out of control and very fearful. And when we dug into the numbers, we found that those who are ABC1 groups, so sort of like in terms of education and income, more affluent in some ways, they have been more positive about what's happened. Probably because of the mental liquidity that they've been able to afford. Those in CDE groups, so lower income groups, have not had obviously as comfortable a situation. And also the over 50s, which is interesting from 2 points. One point could be that the over 50s have felt like they have been protected, they have been focused on, they have been looked after to some extent. And obviously we think about the comfort levels of that sort of retirement moment, whereby you can actually stay in because your plan was to not necessarily go out to work every day. The biggest stress group was the 35 to 40 to 54 year olds. So this is the kind of the midlife moment where potentially you have children, you have big work commitments, you have a lot of moving parts within the middle of your life. And those are the people who tend to be quite negative about what's going on. So we wanted to look at this also in terms of, well, what could be some of the measures? If social distancing was the kind of governing measure for flattening COVID-19, we don't have the answer, but you'll start to see these pink dots popping up, which is one potential measure here is how do we help people see that society in Britain has actually balanced it? So there's a bit of a peer-to-peer learning here, that it's not all bad, that some people have actually got interesting learnings and experiences that other people can learn from. So that human to human exchange could be an interesting thing to become almost like an intermediary for, which is learn from your neighbor and how they've been getting on. We get to the next slide. And we wanted to then analyze this according to one of the things that I saw pop up very quickly was the kind of comfort zone sort of a diagram here. And if we just look at the same results according to types of zone, the majority of people have been in the comfort zone. Again, as I mentioned, certain demographic groups there. But an equal amount have been in fear zone and learning zone. And actually I'm quite rewarded to see that 20% overall have been more into the progressive space. So learning and growing. Obviously very few have set new goals, achieved objectives, found their purpose, or made dreams reality. And for someone like me who, wants to, reinvent lots of things, there's obviously that is very indicative of an early adopter group there, who maybe have the mental or physical liquidity to think about what could be and build back better. So I think there's, from a targeting perspective, this sort of interesting combination of this switching pendulum between fearing and comfort is one thing that I think maybe some of us have probably experienced, but I don't think I've seen it so starkly published within especially mainstream media, and we'll get onto media a bit later. Ville, James, any thoughts at this point before I keep rattling on?
Nothing from me.
No? Okay, all right, keep going. So I think, and again, questions from you all, do you think this is true? Do you think this is something that you feel you've seen within your world? So whether it's sort of coaching or communications or branding or innovation. So do think about your questions here. So then we moved on, we wanted to move on to say, okay, what specifically has maybe caused some of this, this sense of comfort, and at the other end of a polarity, a sense of fear? So on the next slide. So how satisfied have people been? Now, we wanted to kind of go back to Maslow's hierarchy a bit here. So we asked a question, if you keep going, about what are some of the most stressful factors in life, and how satisfied are you with them? So there were two questions here. So on a list of sort of basic almost measures, which we'll talk about in a second, what have people felt satisfied with, and what have they felt dissatisfied with? And according to the things that are most satisfied with, access to water and sanitation, shelter and housing, basic knowledge, i.e. finding out about what you need to do, not necessarily doing higher education, personal safety and security, and access to information communication technology. Now, those 5 things, people have said, those things have been covered, either socially, culturally, economically, or politically. I have had those things in my grasp. I've been able to access those things, use those things, and it's quite interesting given the fact that they are in that top 5 list are the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th most stressful things in life. So I think if those things were actually not being satisfied, we'd have a slightly or a much different conversation around mental health, because those things ultimately affect happiness and a sense of confidence. The things people are most dissatisfied with is quite telling. So equality in society, obviously we've seen the explosion of things like BLM, inclusiveness in society, which can be interesting from a sense of, well, now I've spent more time in my neighborhood and more time in my community because I have maybe had to go to work every day. I've now realized that my community isn't actually maybe as communal as I thought it was. Or I haven't felt like I knew my neighbors, and maybe now we've realized that we're not really that neighborly. So this sense of maybe an assumption that the return to a village mentality wasn't actually there, that people have maybe now wanted that. But the good thing is that those things are not necessarily the most stressful things in people's lives. So even though they haven't been satisfied, they haven't been a trigger for mental stress. But they are certainly things to remedy moving forward if we're going to see a prolonged sort of lockdown sort of moment over the coming 6 months. Work-life balance was interesting. I think a lot of us have felt that the balance was gone out the window because we've just had to make do with our situation at home. That sense of normality, the balance of leaving work at a certain time hasn't been quite as strict. And those of you, I'm sure, who have felt quite zoomed out about the whole situation. And interestingly, one of the things that the fifth element there of communication from our local government and council about what the hell is going on. Interestingly, it's one of the lowest causes of mental stress, but people have been most dissatisfied by it. So I think if we were to think about this in 6 months' time, maybe that will start to be a even higher cause of mental stress moving forward. And one thing we put in there was also number 6 was basic medical care. And again, I think we've all had a proximity to health and wellness, which we've never really had before en masse. So there's been certainly a feeling of feeling that, well, that hasn't quite gone according to plan. We didn't quite have the contingency measures in this country that we hoped for. And obviously that's a post-mortem that will be mopping up in 2021. So if we look at this from a basic human needs perspective on the next slide, one of the things that I think is interesting here is that from a body, well-being, belonging, mind and spirit perspective, the big thing that's lacking here is belonging. So the green or slightly green highlighted variables in the bottom here are the ones that have done quite well. And the pinky ones are the ones that have not been done very well. So interestingly, I think belonging is something that certainly I've noticed in the last couple of years has started to rise as a key trigger for a corporation or a government or institution to lean in and help. And you can start to see here how this essentially is the brief. So as one of the most major measures for flattening the mental health curve, a sense of belonging and elevating people's sense of belonging and equality has to be something that now a lot of our boardrooms, a lot of our government offices have to start focusing on if we're going to alleviate some of the trauma and post-traumatic stress of something like COVID-19. Especially if we start to read things like in the BBC today about another pig-carrying or a pig-orientated pandemic that could be coming out next year. So this for me is a very important focus point of belonging as a word, maybe not necessarily understood enough. And if we start double clicking into words like inclusive society, equality or equal society, and communication from local government, those become very important intervention points for an organization to start working out their role within. James, Ville, any thoughts on that?
Well, my thought is just a quick point about how these things are changing as well as we go, as we got further into lockdown, and as now we ease out of it, and that's different for different countries, obviously. Some of these measures are changing. I remember a study we did early on with, I think it was the Countryside Association. Of course, we were delighted to see that we were all out trying to explore different parts of the local community, and we were sort of really enjoying the community a lot more. I think that might be fading a bit in a sense, given that this is fresher data, and I'm seeing a sense of, okay, well, that was great. It was great to get out and about, but you know, what now, perhaps? So I think just to reiterate, I think this needs to be tracked and monitored, which I think would be quite an interesting story as we move further and further away where we are now.
Yeah, and I think also kind of the results and the analysis point interestingly that mental health and well-being is not an individual issue. Right at the moment when you start to frame it as a kind of challenge of belonging, it becomes kind of interactive issue.
Yes.
The fact that we are totally interdependent on each other, and that's the primary source for well-being and kind of possibility to alleviate mental stress is what is very nicely grounded and kind of framed here.
I agree, because I think also when you think about sustainability as a word, which is often bundled with climate, we're talking about sustaining certain human needs here. And one of the things that we need to think about is being more regenerative, which is again a very often misunderstood word, but going beyond sustainability. So I wouldn't want to see an organization say, based on a feedback loop and the measures of success, saying we are holding the UK public at 50% happiness levels in terms of belonging. It should be, how do we elevate that? How do we regenerate belonging? And I think this becomes a very important brief, and it's something that's quite systemic. It's been building for 10 years since the financial crisis, since our institutions and the big corporates out there in terms of financial services, really we've seen the post-mortem on that, and the unemployment problem as well that has only just begun, I think is also a big issue with regards to a sense of belonging. Because when people are unemployed, their sense of well-being goes dramatically down. Their sense of purpose, their sense of connection to other humans, fellow workers, like-mindedness, and that almost the implicit learning that goes with learning on the job to some extent. So I think this is a very live conversation that I don't think is quite making its way all the way through to the board levels every day. So from an HR perspective as well, there's a lot of conversations around the future of work at the moment and the big comeback to offices, and if we're going to be socially distanced, or what does that mean? But we're going to talk about distancing a bit later.
And another point probably that could be highlighted here is that from the point of view of design and innovation, so the question that we framed, the kind of key argument in our Postnormal Playbook, was that companies should kind of change their point of view from value creation to this idea of being of value. So what's the difference is, of course, that it's not only kind of consumer benefits, etc., that you are trying to figure out when you do new products or hone existing ones, but kind of understanding how could we actually increase belonging, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Well, more to come on that. So, what have people done? In the last 3-4 months have been abnormal for lots of us. What have people done to, I guess, tackle stress on their own terms? And I think your point about this isn't an individual issue, but I think a lot of people have had to say, well, these are my 4 walls now for the foreseeable future. What have I done to try and alleviate mental stress? We go to the next slide. So this for me was a lovely laundry list of all the things you could possibly try and do. And I think a lot of us haven't done a lot of them, which is quite interesting. So we've actually, the majority of us have just got out the house and enjoyed being able to go for a walk. Obviously, it began with individually allowed for 1 hour in this country, and then we were allowed for 2 hours, and then we were allowed in 2 for 2 hours, and then 3 for 2 hours, and now 6 for God knows how long. And then all of a sudden, the beaches are packed. But point being, getting out and actually physically getting into a reality that is not confined by a physical property, that it is about a natural connection. And obviously we haven't all gone mountaineering, but there is a feeling of, for those who are lucky to have had a garden or a shared garden, just having that bit of natural light and natural air has been interesting and good for us. And I think when you think about the lower factors, which we'll talk about in a second, as an ingredient for not maybe belonging, or an ingredient for mental health, enabling people to get into the outdoors and enjoy nature, not necessarily because it's about save the planet, but actually because it's about save the human, I think is a very interesting thing. And I saw a survey last year, if you were to bundle this with this result, which is that the national parks industry, if you were to calculate it in terms of mental health benefits, in terms of the cost of mental health going down, is worth about $6 trillion globally. Obviously, those who are managing directors of national parks are not making dividends on that. But the point being, it does actually have a monetary value if you were to equate it to things like lowering sick days, or lowering hospital visits, or lowering stress levels. So if we can move forward to the next one, I think to your point, James, about the Countryside Alliance, or what it did, the survey you did before. But interestingly, when it comes from actually, it relates to the sense of belonging, being able to just get away from each other. It's true that a lot of people, 1 in 5 people just get, if someone's really causing them stress, I think this would probably happen before COVID-19, you distance yourself from someone who's causing you stress. but actually few want to get away from work commitments. Few want to get away from normality on their own or with friends and family. Much more people want to spend time with friends and family to relax. So I think if we did this at the beginning, it could have been a higher percentage because there was a knee-jerk reaction to I miss people. But as we'll see in a couple of slides, I think some people have actually got used to the distance, and actually they're using belonging as in terms of like almost like a microdose. They're using that social connection as a premium. So when I'm spending time with someone, whether it's friends or family, that's a premium for me now. And not because it's a big journey to go somewhere, maybe through the country to go and see them, but there's a value that's implicit there. And I think some of the things around the kind of Netflix society, the lack of social connection that was clearly building over the last 5 years has maybe been reset. That people have started to say that, you know, I am looking for ways and means to connect people with each other, with myself and other people. And that for me feels like a very important thing. I saw that one brand today, Lululemon, has bought Mirror, which is the Peloton of yoga. And again, moving into the digital space to actually continue the conversation beyond retail, for example, is quite interesting.
I think, Tom, just quickly, I think also I saw a lot of people commentate around the fact that before this, we were getting overloaded. We had diaries back to back, chock-a-block. I mean, we have Zoom calls now, but I think people will now potentially also use this moment to, as we exit, to perhaps go for quality over quantity is perhaps a way to think about that in terms of friends, relationships, activities.
Yeah. So does that create a different dynamic for parents-in-law and there's cousins that you don't really want to see? No, well, it's okay. Just once a month is fine.
Yeah. So to have logged in. We love them.
Yeah. Okay. If we keep going. So the next one is, I thought was interesting to your point around overload. Listening to music and watching a film, we've all obviously been in confines whereby we've obviously had the e-commerce to provide us with equipment if we can afford it. We've all binge watched all sorts of things, I'm sure, something to do with tigers. But the point being that a lot of us have clearly used what was clearly happening before COVID-19 as a natural remedy, which was escapism through content. But interestingly, and as I mentioned before, the most highly stressed as well, being 36 to 54-year-olds, 55-year-olds, the big age group that are feeling the most stressed at the moment because of all the moving dynamics of work and life. But given the pervasive nature of modern media, a lot of us actually prefer to distance ourselves from news content and social media versus spend time with it to relax. And I think if we could assume that from a psychological perspective, I think we've all been a bit disappointed by the lack of truth or the post-truth situation with for example, news media and social media, and how the guardrails with regards to true facts and figures, it was coming for a long time. We've obviously seen it in the last couple of years with regards to the morality of content, and now we've obviously seen the lights of boycotting within things like Facebook. So I think more of us we maybe had the time, we've had the great pause to reflect on what is good and what is bad content, and certainly the nature of paid for content on something like Instagram, whereby it's so obvious now. The redefinition of influencers, how we much rather be influenced by an expert, not a celebrity or someone who's cool, to actually get the right advice about things. So I think that there's a bigger conversation for a later day about brands and branded content and the use of media and the use of different channels if you're going to make an impact. And one good friend of mine who makes documentaries, they are looking at how can they bring the worlds of meme culture with meaningful content. So I think the format and the type of experience of documentary experiences within content are something that we've spent a lot of time as well on understanding through things like Netflix. Okay, and then and I think one of the points here being about, sorry, just go back up on about how we can help potentially people filter and limit negative content and social media, and how negative content is something that we shouldn't be shielded from, but too much of an algorithm that's negative biased is not helping anybody. On the next slide. So And also, this is just an anecdotal thought, but when you look at some of the kind of more physical versus mental things, I think we are still learning to use mind practices. So meditating on doing nothing, figure very low. I think we are still a very sort of physical, proof evidence driven population. We like to know that if I have a glass of something big in my hand, or if I eat something indulgent, or if I go out and do exercise, that I'm physically affecting my mental state, which is obviously that there's a maturity to that. You know, as more people understand that there's psychological benefits of doing something like meditation and etc. But most of us still like a hit of alcohol, which is good for the likes of Pernod Ricard out there. So it's okay, maybe no surprises on this slide, but yeah, okay. And then okay, so some of the remedies there, some of the things that the kind of self-imposed remedies to deal with stress, but we wanted to talk also about, well, who do they turn to? And this was slightly loaded because I said this to James and Ville that years ago I did a project when I was at the Future Laboratory on who do you trust to steer you into the future and to give you guidance. And poets came out top, politicians came out bottom, which I thought was quite a radical radical result. We wanted to sort of ask the same question again to see who do you turn to help you deal with stress, and the results were, I think, a little obvious. If we go to the next slide. So health and wellness professionals, so doctors, psychologists, nurses, yoga teachers, coaches, mentors, and massage therapists, for those 6%. So most people, and also social services people, those people that are within the kind of public realm of dealing with this space. And clearly we've all heralded and rewarded, hopefully, and applauded, clearly, a lot of these people who have been dealing with the situation. And one of the key things here as a business is how do you prioritize, nurture, and grow the medical health and wellness industry? And, you know, I think what is your pledge beyond providing PPE or pivoted business models to do frontline help? You know, what is that permanent commitment to saying, how do I go back and rewrite my articles of association to say we are in the business of human health and wellness, which is a very different pledge ultimately. And clearly the investment required to do that is not about hitting your bottom line straight away. So there's a bigger conversation here, and these are the most trusted professions. But interestingly, if you go down to the next slide.
One comment here, I think, before we go forward is that, I mean, importantly, I believe that there are a lot of different ways how these professions on top of the list actually encounter people in different contexts. And I think for all companies, there are a lot of opportunities. I think like, what is the kind of customer relationship and how is it different from how, say, a retailer would kind of face its customers and treat its customers. And I think starting to understand those dynamics is quite crucial in order to actually understand how could every company to take this caring perspective. Yeah. Moving forward.
I agree. Obviously politicians came up lowest again. But, you know, in some ways, when you think about the governance of a business is mandated to have finance and law at a board level. It's not mandated to have health and wellness. So I think there's something also in the nature of how do we rebuild the top of businesses to make sure that they don't just report to the policy makers and the financing institutions out there. Okay. If we keep going because of time. So do Britons find social distancing or social connecting that relieves stress? And we wanted to test a hypothesis. So Ville, this was your thought, that social connecting is obviously as a counter to social distancing. Is that a buzzword that we should now be hashtagging and saying it's all about social connection, not social distancing? So we wanted to test that. So if we go to the next slide. And for me, this was a little bit surprising. So I think, okay, 3/4 of people in Britain physically connect with other people to reduce their mental stress levels, but not many less still want to keep away from others. So I think there's a little bit of a double-edged sword here, which is that on the one hand, there's clearly a primary objective here, which is providing ways to physically connect with people. How can we do that? What does that mean to all of the permutations of industries like tourism and retail and hospitality and work and things like that? But there is still I think it's quite early for people. People are still feeling nervous. The low touch economy is very real. You know, for example, next week I'm flying to Norway because we want to go home, and we're nervous, but we want to do it. So there's all the anxieties that are in people's minds. So I think testing this after the summer holidays, where people have had a chance to move around a bit and see how they feel, if the distancing thing is still wanted or desired by 68% of people. And interestingly, it's the same for digitally distancing yourself. So knowing that you can actually just step away from those crowd moments to be able to relax. But again, small percentages, but a hypothesis here that Britons appear to be zoomed out as less people prefer to reduce stress by digitally connecting to each other. So I think there's a little bit of I've had enough of doing Zoom homeschooling and Zoom everything right now, and how Zooming obviously is the same as Googling now. So there's a feeling of, I just want to be just slightly disconnected for a second here from that digital medium. But by no means are these statistics absolute. It doesn't say that we're all ready to close our laptops and our devices and go and physically cuddle each other. It's still a very even playing field with regards to essentially channels to market here for a brand. And when we ask consumers about, well, what can a brand do? If you go to the next slide, it's pretty identical. So if you go to the next slide, yeah. Pretty identical in the fact that even after experiencing social distancing in the past months, to deal with mental stress, Britons would mostly find it helpful if a brand made physical connection and or distancing hassle-free and a joy. So again, this is the beginnings. You know, Ville, you wanted to set this up as a bit of a thesis conversation of like, we need to continue exploring this, and we need to continue talking about all of the types of industries that are about human density, right? So retail, tourism, hospitality, events, sports, and say, you know, and the list goes on. What does this mean in terms of a pretty even split of just whatever it is, whether I want to disconnect or connect? I want to feel like you're making it easy for me. So I guess everyone on the call, this is a brief for us all. How do we continue to dive into these results here? And track them, because I don't think this is an absolute answer yet. Okay.
For example, in Finland, I think we've already noticed that there is a strong urge to kind of get back to this level of connection that we used to have. So it's all the terraces are flooding with people. Everybody is getting together, regardless of the risks. So it's just like kind of connection is, or the need for connection is so strong, yes, that overrides kind of all other kind of concerns related to connection.
Yeah. And then when asked the question, can a brand help? No, not really. So most people say, no, why? And again, this is the implicit, you know, human reaction. This is often what comes up when you ask a human, would you like anyone to help you who's trying to make money out of you? And they mainly say yes. Sorry, they say no. But interestingly, the top four, if you could call them a top four, there's something interesting about these sort of institutional type brands. If you go to the next slide, because there's something about the fact that they have the BBC, Amazon, Boots, and Google. Waterstones is a bit of a curveball because we haven't been there. But BBC, Amazon, Boots, and Google, they've sort of owned the three big moments within our household. So the TV or our devices, e-commerce and those deliveries, and then obviously searching for things. So if there's a bit of an interesting reflection here, you know, if you're in these industries, well done. But if there's something also about health retail, so the idea that health, e-commerce, health retail, and search industries have actually dominated our lives. So screens, deliveries, health and wellness retail. So these become very interesting channel conversations. So I think instead of the kind of dealing with the coalface, dealing with the doorstep. This has become a very interesting moment for a business to think about its role within those doorstep situations where you're dealing with the delivery or you're dealing with a human connection versus a high street or the dominance of high street here. And clearly, everyone is now playing the e-commerce game. But I think the fact that there's very low results here, but also I thought it was quite interesting, loads of confectionery brands. So, we've got brands like, for example, the likes of Kit Kat here and Magnum and Galaxy, punching up their weight there against Apple, beg your pardon, and the likes of Samsung here. So, hats off to the chocolate brands out there who are also doing very well against the big mega systems of the world. Okay, so I think to conclude with, and we have only a little bit left. Yes, no Primark or Sports Direct on one of the comments. No, unfortunately. So in terms of then, final couple of slides. So this is a bit of we'll leave this up for Q&A, but I guess a reflection, if we were to pull together those pink dots of potential measures, and therefore if an organization was going to help, connecting people becomes a big brief, providing ways and means to connect people with each other, elevating people's sense of belonging and equality, nurturing health, elevating access to basic medical care as it's lacking, and prioritizing nurturing and growing the medical health and wellness industry. Being positive, helping people see that society is balancing comfort and fear, it's not all bad, and helping people filter negative content in social media. Embracing nature, enabling people to get into the outdoors and enjoy nature, and then staying home. I think emphasizing that access to basic fundamental things is safeguarded. So if you're an energy provider, for example, or a landlord or those sorts of things, really communicate the fact that those things are governed. Or safeguarded, and then helping people deal with mental stress via screen delivery and health and wellness retail moments. So thoughts, questions, what are people's reactions to this?
Yeah.
I hope there are.
So before everybody else jumps to ask questions, I have one. So I think all these are really inspiring kind of fundamentals from my point of view. Kind of if we can fix these 5 areas for everybody, I think life would be arguably better. But what do you think? Like what's beyond? Like if we think that companies should now try to realign themselves around this idea of care and realign their kind of consumer touch points in a way that they would usher this idea of healing, not just consumer value or kind of customer experience. But what could that be? Would it be enough if we kind of work with these 5 areas and increase that, or is there something else?
James, do you want to jump in on that?
I think, well, one point I wanted to just say is that I think we're talking about brands out there talking to consumers. But we're also talking about the whole population here as well, which means that there are other touch points, which I think to bring to the table and perhaps see what everybody thinks is to talk about businesses and their role as an employer. And we see employment levels are going to go down for some time, I guess, but focusing on how businesses can help employees.
Yeah.
We do an annual study of in a couple of countries of employee well-being, and under the theme that everybody, 1/4 of the people in the UK have been diagnosed with a mental health problem. But from our studies, and under the theory of everybody has well-being, everybody has mental well-being, 68% of people at work last year in our study, we're repeating it right now, said that they'd suffered from stress, anxiety, depression in the last 12 months. So you see how that number goes up. You might not have been diagnosed with it, but a lot of people are affected. Did a separate study in the marcoms industry, which might be quite relevant to all of us. And that number shot from 68 up into the high 80s of people who said that in the last 12 months they'd suffered from anxiety, etc. And I think, just to leave that on the table in terms of what more can businesses do for their employees? just separate to that, in a separate study, where we track the relationship between businesses and trust from the community. A lot of people trust their company a lot more, the company that they work for, a lot more than companies in general. You have affiliation to your employer. So I think there's a real bond there that can be used perhaps to accelerate change as we move out of here. Yes, focusing on brands and design and how they can affect their customers, massive. But also let's look inside too, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting and important point, that this is a systemic issue, and starting from inside, from kind of the employee experience, is one key aspect of the whole issue.
And on that point, Lucia, who's Hargasova, who's joined today, she asked two questions. One is, how do we get leaders, as many leaders, to listen to this message? And then why is it that the UK is not investing more in the likes of coaches and practitioners, like yoga practitioners, who are dealing with a lot of the kind of wellness factors? And I think there is definitely a hierarchy here that needs to be tackled, which is some call it emotional intelligence, but Stanford has now said that their top, the fifth most important skill that MBA curriculums are putting in is about emotional intelligence. So there's definitely I think a need for leaders to not just listen to this presentation, but to understand some of these slightly more softer aspects of what does human progress mean. And I think one of the long-term burn effects of something like the financial industry that is put GDP on a pedestal, again, often reported about how GDP is certainly not going to be the measure of success post-pandemic. It has to be other sort of measures like happiness. Now, unfortunately, I've said that for many years to brands at corporate level when saying, how do we, shoehorn this into your P&L? And the response has been, that's lovely because you studied fashion. No, that's not the point. The point being is that it is a metric of success. And the challenge is trying to get this conveyed in a way, and this is, obviously, academically, it's been well proven. Politically, it's not really within policy. But I think the Green New Deal, for example, the buyback clauses of saying, if you want to be a corporation in the 2020s, this is the terms and conditions for if you want bailing out. But that's been very much a climate orientation. It hasn't been a human health orientation. So I think this is a very important conversation to have around, you're only as good as the talent you have in your company. If we're talking from a work perspective, and they will not come back if your office hasn't been future-proofed in this respect for health and wellness.
And I think in many ways it all starts from our understanding of the world and what it is about being human. What is that all about? And then it's all about metrics. Because I think what is urgently needed also is that we are upgrading the metrics, how we measure our success. If we measure, for example, our success through engagement rates or click rates, something like that, it's a parody of what's actually going on the human level, and understanding that if we are more capable of actually measuring what really matters, then, for example, if there is an aspect of kind of lasting joy or equality in those equations and metrics, so I think then we are again taking one step further. And I think reflecting this back to the fact that what really matters for all companies and organizations is how they create connections and relationships with people who are participating their actions, kind of the systemic view and all those participants. And if the companies and organizations are capable of increasing the level, the quality of those relationships, they are going to succeed. And I think this is the way how we need to start, in my opinion, to start to reframe the discussion.
Yeah, and if anyone's got any more questions, a couple more quickly from Judy. You mentioned the Britons have high truth for certain professions. I wonder, did you ask the question which relationships are most important to you? No, we didn't, unfortunately, Judy. But I think one of the things about that is that the friends and family dimension to this. One of the things that I've certainly noticed within talking to a lot of businesses has been we've taken rightly so, we've taken COVID-19 very personally. And I think for professionals, this has become something that isn't on a spreadsheet. It's not something you get a research agency to tell you and show you the data. We've all felt this at our doorsteps daily. So this has become a very real situation where, you know, nearly 100% of us have been affected emotionally by this. Now, the kind of the comeback or the go back to normality, i.e. being able to go out and go back to our offices, I think it's very interesting how a lot of us are going to potentially forget some of the lovely familiar things about relationships that we've learned, you know, whether it's clapping at 8 o'clock every Thursday evening, or whether it's for the NHS, or whether it's just the implicit nod to each other as neighbors. And I think some of those things need to be codified and need to be built back into not just HR functions and Friday night drinks, but other ways in which benefits are given to employees. That's my perspective on that one. Yeah, David here, optimism, inclusion and involvement seem important. And I think, you know, that the Simon Sinek point there, as you said, optimism versus positive mindset, you know, that there's optimism without it being naive. I think there's also a very real resilience that's required to handle this. Being adaptive and being able to handle stress. And I think when we think about the younger population who this is their second recession within 10 years, but at the same time, they're especially if you're like 18 to 25, the experience you've had is going to really set you up as an adult when you start, if at all, go into the workplace now with any sense of normality. So I think a lot of those dynamics are going to be very interesting as well. Okay, any other final questions? Oh, couple.
Yeah.
Jason, Mazout here. Did you pick up on the pressure of people, their bosses and their colleagues at work as they overperform? No, but interestingly, in a separate conversation or something that I'm working on, the privacy, the public-private on-off dynamic. A lot of people who are not equipped or experienced at working from home have been laying down all sorts of interesting mandates, which is, it's 7:03 in the morning. Why aren't you on my Zoom when I want you to be? Because the day hasn't started yet. So I think a lot of people are now learning generationally the differences between those who actually grew up on the likes of Zoom, those who have just now adopted Zoom. And clearly there's an age difference there. And the etiquette around when is off and when is on, and when is private and when is not private. So I think in terms of surveillance culture, working from anywhere increasingly means I'm being productive regardless of the fact that if I'm sunbathing or not. So I think there's some interesting dynamics there that haven't been ironed out with regards to what is performance. Okay.
I think this has been a fantastic summary. What the idea of better mental well-being could look like from the human point of view. And I think now the question for all of us probably moving forward is that, and this is an ongoing discussion, but the idea that I've long believed that every company, every brand has to position themselves in relation to the idea of well-being. How am I actually going to help people live better lives in the future? No, not only kind of the consumers who are the primary kind of focus groups of our action, but everybody around us. So I think this is a question that will frame the will frame the ways how companies could deliver actual value. And I think now we've covered some of the aspects really nicely here. And now the question probably is that needs to be researched, explored further. And how could we start from here and then move forward? Because ultimately, the kind of healing that we need is not only on individual level, but it's collective healing as well as the healing of the whole biosphere and its inhabitants.
Yeah.
For the next 10 years, I think that's the task we have in our hands.
Yeah.
So there is one more question from Jason, who's been researching people at shopping centers and understanding how people are feeling free to spend a fortune and have the space versus hellish other people. Not a question though, just a comment. But yeah, that's true. Yeah. So I think this is probably the big question for moving forward, is that how can we redefine what physical social connection is all about, and how can different companies, organizations actually facilitate that and be of value?
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's a utopia, but everyone's different. Everyone's got their own needs and wants and desires, their own situation, their own context, not just income or affluence based or geography based, but their minds are all thinking different things. And I think, how does a business even start to diagnose what is going to make each person happy? So if you have a shopping center or a massive office or a concert hall or a public park or a high street, or, you know, how do you diagnose these 5 things or other things so that everyone walks away feeling like they are regenerated and elevated after the experience? And that clearly is something that is not easy to do at all. But I think,
and even from an employee perspective, back to that again, some of the research we've been doing, you know, it's a complete mix on employees. Some are having a great time, a third can't wait to get back, a third never want to go back, and a third maybe sometime. And then again, it seems to break into thirds. A third really stressed, a third living the dream. And to your points in your presentation, Tom, talking about the different age groups, different generations experiencing things differently, I think that's an important point to make, is this, that I think so many people have had different experiences over the last 3 months. You saw some of those brands just filter, you know, 4, 4, 4, 5, 5, 5. You see the respondents just have such a mix of thoughts and feelings right now that sure, there are a few winners at the top, but then it's just massive spread, and they were allowed to choose 3, right? So you know, all spread out across.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, that was the short list of a long list of the YouGov most recognized brands in the UK. And interestingly, in the top 20 most recognized brands in the UK, I think half of them are chocolate brands. So there's that's a whole different conversation around
part of well-being.
Thank fuck I got my Twix. You know, it's like I don't need Google right now. I just got a Kit Kat. Yeah.
I think on a very basic level, I think all this starts from asking different kind of questions. So as we've already seen here, if we frame the questions in a way that we are really honestly interested in understanding what mental well-being means for people who we serve, and then starting to understand what are the different opportunities there, what are the requirements, what are the needs, I think that already opens up a lot of new avenues for being of value for people. And I think simple things like this.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've spoken to, I think, everyone who's joined in the last couple of months, is we need to create movements around this. So we need to create platforms or arenas and not rely on the likes of LinkedIn and let the algorithms decide what gets through. You know, we need to create much more public arenas for conversations like this and all the others that are out there. The amount of intellectual property that's been flying around to try and talk about what's going on. You know, how do we make sense of that in a simple way that leads to action and change? And maybe that's the conversation, those of you out there who have platform experience, of how do we all work together to do this? Cool.
Great.
So all the slides will be sent out to everybody, and obviously distribute as you see fit. And the recording of this, I think, Ville, you're going to post that out soon as well as you.
Yeah, we'll have the link sent out to everybody also in a couple of days latest. But
Yeah.
it's been a pleasure, and I think as we are already a few minutes over our original schedule, I think it's
You can tell everyone's working from home. No one's dropped. Everyone's, I'll make another coffee. Let's go. Come on.
Just a starter. But I think it would be very interesting to continue the conversation in different venues in the next few months. But I think this is a starting point for us asking different kind of questions to be able to really be of value for people and everybody else around us.
Yeah.
Definitely. On that point, Ville, if anyone attending had a burning question that we clearly missed out on, remember this was a conversation starter. So feel free to suggest any areas we might explore, and we'd certainly be happy to do that and continue the conversation and the journey.
Yeah. And also, if anyone's got a guinea pig corporate who wants to have a go at doing this, then let's put them on the table. Which sounds strange. But
Great shout.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you,
Thank you
James.
both. Nice to see you all again.
All the
See you soon.
participants.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye for now.
Yeah.
Bye.
Take
Bye.
care.